Welcome back. It's a real pleasure today to bring to the table Dave Wennergren. Dave, as many of you know, is one of the real luminaries in the government modernization, technology modernization environment. From his leadership, very distinguished career as the CIO of the Department of Navy, at the Department of Defense, and currently he's the CEO of ACT-IAC, which is probably the most important IT modernization government industry community in our government industry community, and a very important partner to SSLC and an old friend of mine from having worked with Dave for many years. Dave is also the chair of the National Academy of Public Administration, which is another very important partner of SSLC. So Dave is just one of those really VIPs in our community, and it's a privilege and a pleasure, Dave, to have you join us today. So let me just ask you to start and tell us a little bit about what you're doing today, wearing both of those hats at ACT-IAC and at NAPA, and then tell us where you were in 2002 when the eGov Act was passed, and what was your take on it, and any involvement you might have had in those early days of its implementation?
Well, it's great to be with you, John. And as you pointed out, our paths have crossed going back to 20 years ago today, as it were, back during the implementation of the eGov Act. As you pointed out, I had the honor 20 years ago to be able to be part of the implementation of the eGov Act when I was vice chair of the Federal CIO Council and serving as the Department of the Navy CIO. And we'll talk more about that. But it's great to sort of fast forward to now, where I get to be the CEO of ACT-IAC, whose whole purpose is about accelerating government mission outcomes by bringing together industry and government on these big technology issues. So we can talk about how much the world has changed, but then we can also talk about how there are still things that need to be done and continuing on 20 years later. So it's probably good to reflect back on what the world was like 20 years ago. You know, there was a growing recognition of the importance of technology and the role that it played, I'll say, in every mission area of the government. You had the mid-1990s when the Clean Code Act passed and set up agency CIOs. And then at the turn of the millennium, there were sort of like these two twin peaks of energy, Y2K on the one hand, and then the dot-com e-business bubble that took place. And on the heels of that dot-com bubble, there was a recognition that the power of the internet was tremendous and would change the way we think about work, the way we live, work, and play. But there was a lot of stuff going on when the eGov Act was created. There was, I'll say, a proliferation of single-purpose, single-use websites, and everybody could get online and try to build stuff. And so there was a lot of energy and enthusiasm, and that was great. But when you're doing a lot of stuff individually, over and over again, place by place by place, you end up with a lot of duplication of effort. You end up with a lot of extra costs as everybody builds out the same websites over and over and over again, the same apps over and over and over again. And you also end up with, like, surprisingly, sort of barriers to information sharing because you've created electronic stovepipes. So that becomes sort of the world that you find yourself in as the eGov Act gets implemented. And if I think back to the passage of the eGov Act, it provided a focus on so many important things. And, we could spend the whole time talking about that, but I would just sort of highlight, number one, the power and importance of a web-based mobile world. I mean, these kind of devices were not ubiquitous then, but the work of the eGov Act paved the way for us to be able to live off of mobile devices today. The imperative for new thinking about cybersecurity, the need for governance and instantiation of an eGov administrator, now the federal CIO and the federal CIO Council, the power of performance measurement. There's no doubt about it, the things that we measure, the things we focus our time and attention on, the sort of advent of customer experience as an important element of developing technology. It's something that you care passionately about, as do I. The importance of shared services and bringing together common support services for government. And of course, the importance of business cases and actually understanding return on investment and not just doing technology for technology's sake.
Yeah, well, a lot of threads there, Dave. We could spend hours, I'm sure, unraveling each and every one of them. But you mentioned something that none of our other speakers have mentioned before. I think there's something to this, that at the time the eGov Act was in its gestation, before it was enacted, we had the Y2K experience and the dot-com bubble. And I'm wondering particularly about Y2K. Did you think that helped in any way to prepare us to bring a focus to some of the issues that then became embedded in the eGov Act? And did all that work? It turned out to be kind of a non-event, Y2K at the time, because of all the mitigation that went on. Did that
That's another
somehow
problem with cybersecurity things, right? We don't thank our cybersecurity professional that nothing bad happened today. But something bad does happen, then they're front and center of the news, and I think Y2K sort of falls in that camp. That because of all the work that got done, it became, as you said, a non-event. But I do think that Y2K had an important, point to make, that technology was everywhere. And so it really sort of raised technology awareness away from just raised floor computer rooms to be all about, hey, technology is running every mission system of the organization. And so, the general public had suddenly a much better awareness of the power and promise and potential peril of technology if not done right. And so, it sort of, I think, bodes well for like a better recognition about cybersecurity, and fortunately and unfortunately, the need to modernize. And which continues to be a challenge today that we can talk about more, that, technology modernization continues to be a challenge we got to focus our time and attention on. And you found yourself in an interesting situation 20 years ago where you had pockets of haves and have-nots, people that were willing to embrace moving to the web, moving away from the enclave network mentality to using the internet, and those that didn't want to. And so it created a lot of interesting challenges. Number one, cybersecurity had to be thought about differently in an internet-based world. But also the need to share information became suddenly more powerful. And so you can no longer have solutions that just sort of lock things away just for my team on my local network. I had to find ways to be able to share information while raising the bar on security.
Yeah, for sure. So Dave, take us back now. In 2002, the act was passed. It kicked over to the Bush administration for implementation. Our friend Mark Foreman was the eGov czar at that time, and he launched a lot of interesting initiatives. Where were you? When did you kind of get into the thick of things in that early time frame? Were you at the Navy, or had you gone up to DOD at that point? And what was your initial role in responding to the implementation of the act?
Well, as you noted, I was the CIO of the Department of the Navy, and so I got to sort of watch as Mark created the thought energy and thought leadership around. We could take advantage of this, the Quicksilver projects that led to the eGov initiatives in the line of business. I sent my deputy, Rob Carey, off to be part of the Quicksilver team. And that's where we first all met Karen Evans, who then, of course, came on to become Mark's successor as the next eGov administrator. And that's sort of my fondest memories are working with Karen when I was vice chair of the CIO Council and she was the eGov administrator, now the job that would be the federal CIO. And they were sort of times of significant accomplishment because Karen had a strong execution mindset and was able to sort of drive implementation well. And me having the benefit of being part of the Department of Defense, we're able to bring a lot of sort of hands to the table. And so we were able to make a lot of progress on the things that I think sort of tee us up for today. The power of these mobile web-based solutions, new thoughts around identity management and cybersecurity, the power of enterprise licensing agreements, the common services ideas, things that continue to provide value to us today, particularly as we think about things like a pandemic that have required us to drastically rethink what it means to work from anywhere, anytime. And so those are all sort of fond memories I have of what was going on back in those days. I would think also, as we mentioned before, the other thing that stands out in my mind is the explosion of opportunities to radically change the way we live, work, and play. I mean, there were pockets of resistance to taking advantage of these web-based technologies, but overall, there was this high energy around what the power of the internet could mean in terms of delivering services to people, regardless of where they were located, be able to collaborate around the world, the advances in things like telemedicine and telemaintenance and other things that just like radically changed the way work was done.
Yeah. So Dave, you had really two roles during those times, and this went for several years, as you had a role as CIO of the Department of the Navy, and then you moved to Defense. But you were also very active as you shared at the CIO Council, and so you were working government-wide, and you were also working within the Department of the Navy and the Department of Defense. Talk a little bit about what went on in the. Let's come back then to the government-wide, but within the Department of the Navy and DoD. What do you recall as as some of the early challenges of implementing the eGov Act and some of the early results and some of the challenges you dealt with there?
Well, I think that, we positioned ourselves well for the sort of emergence of the dot-com bubble, if you will. And before I was the CIO of the Department of the Navy, I was the deputy CIO and worked for Dan Porter when he was the CIO. And Dan was truly I'll say a transformational leader, a visionary kind of leader. And so, of course, the Navy had moved out on the Navy Marine Corps intranet at the time, which was a way to sort of move from a culture of haves and have-nots, where our operational units had like bad technology and R&D facilities had good technology, and everybody was disconnected, to have more of a common infrastructure, common directory services, common apps and stuff, so people could begin to collaborate more together. And then we created an e-business operations office for the Department of the Navy to explore the potential for these sorts of tools to take place. And then both in my time at the Department of the Navy and then at the Department of Defense, putting into place these underlying tools that would make this happen, because there was a need for infrastructure. Not only did you need to be able to be well connected to the internet, but there had to be these common services. And one of them in particular was identity management. So sort of spawned what became the Common Access Card Initiative for DoD, to put public key infrastructure credentials and a smart card in the hands of 3.5 million people, so that they could do things like, log on from anywhere, do digital signatures to allow us to move from paper-based processes to web-based internet age solutions. And so a lot of that sort of underlying work helped launch the department's ability to take advantage of what the eGov Act offered.
Sure. So you had some wins. You had some impressive results in the Department of Defense and in the Department of the Navy. And were those, do you think, enabled by the eGov Act? Were those things that might not have happened without the impetus of the eGov Act behind them?
I think whenever you place emphasis on what you want done, then progress gets made. And we alluded to Y2K a little earlier in the conversation, and for some reason no one wanted to go to see the White House Y2K guy, John Koskinen, and the Secretary of Defense every month and tell them that no progress had been made on remediating or retiring systems. So there is no doubt about it that the things that we focus our time and attention on, right, are the things that the bosses are interested in and the bosses are measuring. And so I think putting a laser-like focus on, so a half dozen years after the Clinger-Cohen Act, that we were really serious about changing the way we deliver technology, and that we were actually going to make it a priority in things like the president's management agenda, in things like the meetings across cabinet organizations, in areas like the Federal CIO Council, what was going to be the priority of the work. If you look at the way the Federal CIO Council organized when you and I were there, we focused on issues that would help make this a reality. Best practices, future of the workforce, how to take care of the architecture, and all those sorts of topics. So clearly, statutory imperatives like the eGov Act help drive behavior, help focus attention, help bring energy where it's needed.
No question. And you saw that in the Department of the Navy and DoD. From your role on the CIO Council, as you were working more government-wide, how did you see that play out across the government? Did you see pockets of resistance in some agencies, or did you see pretty unified support behind these initiatives? And what do you remember particular initiatives that came out of the OMB agenda in those days that Mark and Karen then pushed forward that bore fruit more than others? What do you recall of some of the highlights of that early agenda?
Yeah, well, I had to throw anybody under the bus. So I think the more tactful way to say it is, you had to meet people where they were. And I would say back in those days, the Federal CIO Council was a very, disparate, a wide range of where we were, how far we'd come in terms of the ability of the agency to make these sort of moves. Were you doing enterprise buying initiatives? Were you using modern technology? Had you modernized your systems? Had you prepared yourself for a web-based world? All those things sort of drove your ability to respond to the eGov Act. Did your CIO have a seat at the table, or even more importantly, did they have a voice at the table, right? Were they part of the leadership team? All those things sort of drove the capacity to respond. And so you had to sort of think about, we're not all going to move at the same pace in the same direction, but we could sort of have some general vectors that we're all heading in this direction. And then how do you build up people to be able to take advantage of that? And that's why I think in the early years of implementation, a lot of time was spent sort of, where were eGov initiatives where we could get traction and energy and bring some along, right? And then others could take advantage of that. What were lines of business that we had to do something about,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And then like, how could we put into place sort of the underlying structures that would help? And that's why we did a lot of work on things like enterprise software licensing agreements, so that people had access to the tools that they needed, things like secure versions of operating systems that everybody could use so that they could be more internet based and still have greater security, identity management tools like PKI smart cards. And so I think all of those things are like speak well to the fact that there became a strong recognition that we had to function as a broader enterprise rather than a lot of standalone organizations. And that's not to say that, each agency doesn't have unique missions that have to be able to be taken care of. But there are some of the common directions that you have to head together, or else the disparities between organizations and between boundaries will create friction that will keep you from being able to share information broadly.
Yeah, that's well said, Dave. Thanks. Well, let's fast forward a little bit more now. You have been observing, you've been in the trenches, and you've been observing from other positions outside of government since those days. What do you recall from as the eGov initiatives and shared services evolved from through the Bush administration into the Obama administration and into the recent Trump administration and today under the Biden administration? What have you recall of that evolution path through now 3 additional administrations since then?
Yeah, well, there are some imperatives that transcend party and politics, we'll just say, right? And I think we're speaking to those now. The imperative for cybersecurity, a national issue that with the intellectual capital of our nation at risk, right? The imperative for technology modernization. 80% of your technology budget goes to sustain an aging legacy base, and systems and infrastructure no longer supported. You will never be able to take advantage of the internet age that the eGov Act tried to push us to. And to a subject near and dear to your and my heart, the importance of shared services, right? That, if you're a Fortune 100 company, you don't build your own payroll system. You don't build your own CRM solution. There are companies that do that for a living and do it exceptionally well. And yet in government, everybody had such a strong sense of personal control that they wanted to build it all and own it all themselves, which ends up with situations like, frankly, some organizations just should not be in the business of doing IT operations. And as you've been such a great champion for over the years, this idea about common mission support services that could be done by people who are expert in the field allow organizations to let the finite number of government resources that they have focus on the government mission of the agency and let the support services be done by somebody who, more qualified to do it. So these are strong thoughts that sort of transcend party, transcend administrations. At the same time, though, it's important, I think, for everybody listening to remember that, when a new administration comes to town, they want to do new things. And so, you have to sort of be ready for that and accept that. And the prize is, are there outcomes that need to continue? Right. And it needs to be less about like the name of the initiative, because, whether we call them eGov initiatives, lines of business, shared services initiatives, QSMOs, the important thing is each of those 4 administrations that you mentioned recognize the value of, for example, shared services, right? And recognize the value of technology modernization and kept pushing for those things to get done. And so I think oftentimes what happens, particularly for the career folks that have to live through the continuing change that takes place as more new political appointees arrive, is that, we get so wedded to the, this was my system and it's my baby, and, nobody can mess with it. And that's just a recipe for friction, right? Because really the answer was, what were we trying to accomplish? What do we want to achieve? How can we sort of leverage the best of what we have to continue on while we shed ourselves of the things that are no longer providing value?
Yeah, that's a great perspective, Dave. Well, looking back now 20 years, what stands out in your mind as what are the most important lessons learned, and what's the unfinished business that still needs to be addressed? And what's worked, what hasn't worked? If you had the ear of the DDM, and you're a very important and influential guy, I expect you have those conversations with Jason Miller at OMB. What would you whisper in his ear as the most important thing that he could do in the next 2 years of this first term of this administration to advance the ball?
Well, let's start with unfinished business, and then we'll move to lessons learned. Because unfinished business is an interesting one. Because as you look at the last 20 years, so much has changed. As we mentioned before, we live our lives now on these smartphones that have apps, recognize a common platform, but the flexibility of the apps that delight you and your needs. And that's a radically different world than the way the world was 20 years ago. So a web-based self-service world where you're able to operate mobily from any place, anytime to get the mission done is a powerful and important change that's taken place. And I'll say hand in hand with that is the pace of technology change, which remains relentless. In fact, is probably increasing each year over those 20 years. So that said, though, over the last 20 years, some things have remained the same. And as we talked about then, technology modernization remains a huge issue, right? We still have many organizations spending the vast majority of their technology budgets sustaining aging legacy base that is not allowing them to rapidly take advantage of the new technologies that are out there. I would say during the pandemic, there was a direct correlation between progress that an organization had made in technology modernization and its ability to adapt to a virtual world and the new virtual technologies you would need to survive in that world and take advantage of new technologies that go on. And so, we got to do something about that. That continues to be important. Cybersecurity continues to be an imperative. And the recognition that cybersecurity solutions, number one, have to be sort of baked in from the beginning rather than an afterthought when you're doing your technology solutions, but also that this web-based mobile world requires us to focus differently on things like zero trust, on advances in identity management, on data level security, ways to actually enhance the ability to do work in an internet world rather than thwart the ability to move outside of a closed-in network. And of course, we'd be remiss if we didn't at least do a foot stomp about cultural change, which continues to be, the biggest challenge in the technology business. It's much less about the availability or capacity of technology and much more about the need to make sure that organizations and processes have changed to take advantage of that. So that's what sort of still lays on the table. But then having said that, the eGov Act has ushered in some really important lessons learned. And I just would like the focus on mission execution. I really think that that's powerful. There was a recognition that technology wasn't just about support systems in the back office. The technology drove the mission of organizations, the imperative for customer experience and actually involving the user in the development and thinking through how the technology would actually, help enhance the ability of people to do business with the government. Important part of the eGov Act. We talked about performance measurement. This idea about, outcomes matter. And if you track the progress of your outcomes, you'll align people to the outcomes that you want to achieve. The value of return on investment and business case. We should not be building technology solutions that take 30 years to pay off, nor should we be taking 30 years to implement technology solutions. The importance of shared services solutions to allow government agencies to focus on their core mission, let others do the support work. And again, the power of a web-based mobile world. I think to me, that's the prize of the eGov Act. Was a recognition by some visionary people 20 years ago that the world was shifting dramatically. And if we wanted to stay apace of that, we would have to move to a new way of doing business that allowed us to take advantage of being able to work from anywhere at any time, get the intellectual capacity of the whole organization together and create solutions that would drive outcomes.
Yeah, that's really well said, Dave. So what would you advise Jason Miller if you had his ear? And what are one or two things, big things that he might do to complete the unfinished business?
Well, stay strong because, it takes relentless communication. As we've talked about, what remains the same 20 years later, right? There are still the federal government is a massively big organization and extremely complex, and it takes time to make change take place. And so you got to stay strong. I give the administration a lot of credit for what's in the president's management agenda and also the recently released federal IT operating plan, which focuses on what I'll say are clearly the top issues that face us today. So stay strong about technology modernization. Things like the Technology Modernization Fund are important. They help seed the change, but also recognizing that technology modernization is a lot more than just moving to the cloud. Technology modernization is about dealing with the thousands of legacy systems and applications that are still sort of eating up the budgets and maybe no longer delivering, at least some.
No kidding.
Looking at which ones we should retire, which ones we should replace. Stay strong about cybersecurity and new approaches to cybersecurity that enhance the ability to use commercial solutions rather than right? Falling back on one-off government-only solutions, the imperative for customer experience, and the need to do better with data. I mean, all those things drive, the ability for the government to be more effective and deliver the mission to the citizens. And of course, shared services is a strong part of that too.
Yeah, Dave, what a great ending note here. Stay strong and keep the funds flowing, I think would be another part of that too. Dave, it's just been a pleasure having you with us here today. You truly are one of the most thoughtful leaders in our community and one of the most effective leaders as well. And congratulations on your success, your service to our country, and in your current role at ACT-IAC and as chair of the National Academy of Public Administration. Thanks so much, Dave, and we look forward to further teaming in the future with you.
Excellent. Thank you, John. It's been a great journey so far. I've so enjoyed working with you over the years, and I look forward to many adventures ahead.
Same here. Take care, Dave. Thank you.